Welcome back. We've been talking today about politics and why so many people are disengaged today from the political process. One reason may be people's loss in faith in the politicians themselves. We're joined now by Montgomery College history professor Lee Annis, who is also the author of a book that highlights one of the foremost politicians of the late 20th century. The book is called Howard Baker, Conciliator in an Age of Crisis. And Lee, welcome to Campus Conversations.
Thank you, Stephen Fritzi.
And we're going to acknowledge that for a lot of our audience, out of sight, out of mind, they're going to say, first of all, who was Howard Baker? But this is a politician that you had a chance to come to know and did a wonderful account of, who played a key role at least a couple of points in our somewhat modern history in the Nixon administration, Reagan administration, and in his role in Congress. Who is Howard Baker?
Okay, the first thing that everybody's going to recall is during the Watergate hearings, he was the vice chairman who did put the question, which was the only one that needed to be answered. What did the president know? When did he know it? Now we ask that whenever anything comes up. But he's also the Republican leader in the Carter and Reagan years of the Senate, minority first and then majority. And then he's the guy when Iran-Contra came out, he ended his own presidential candidate and came to be chief of staff in Ronald Reagan's White House. And
I think that's important. In your book, you talk about how he wanted to be president. Right. He could have been a strong contender for president in 1988.
Right.
And, of course, the Reagan administration's in the middle of Iran-Contra, and things are really spiraling downward. And we are concerned in discussing it in our earlier segment today about why people lost faith in politics. He sort of understood that what was important at that time was not his own candidacy, but helping America by stepping in and solving things.
Right. He had a little bit of experience in the Nixon administration. He'd advised Nixon before the hearings to bring everything out as quickly as possible, as open as possible. Nixon didn't listen. He gave the same advice to Ronald Reagan right as soon as he took over the job. I'm sure he may have said that privately beforehand, but Reagan took his advice. Reagan was eventually allowed to go forward with his administration, and he did see to it that the INF treaty was signed with the Soviet Union, and the last 2 years of Reagan's administration were better than the third two, the one that immediately preceded it.
And thinking about his role, giving up his own presidential campaign to do sort of what was good for the country, one of the things you said that one of his colleagues said was that when you see Howard coming, you feel better, which is, I think, such a nice compliment. Why so?
He knew how to resolve conflicts. I wish there was something in the water that could make everybody do that, but he knew how to. He knew how to deal with colleagues of all stripes in the Senate, and knew how to put things together. You find, for example, on the environmental legislation of the 60s and 70s, he and Edmund Muskie worked together. Muskie was a guy, though, with a volcanic temper. And a lot of times Muskie would get frustrated, and it did take working with a lot of people, many of whom can be annoying and many of whom have their own special interests. But Baker had a knack of putting things together, and these great Clean Air and Water Acts of 1970 went through with no negative votes on the Democratic side, no negative votes on the Republican side.
Who are the Howard Bakers of today? Or I'm afraid of the answer is that maybe they don't exist. And that's part of the premise of what we've been discussing today is politics has come down even more, it would seem, than before. Red, blue, and black, white, so to speak, and trying to get people to work across the aisle, so to speak. Not
That's a good question, and somebody raised it with me about 3 years ago with the political science department of the University of Tennessee. We couldn't find one in the Senate. Let me give you one who does know how to resolve differences. Sometimes Democrats can fight amongst each other as hard as Democrats fight Republicans, and perhaps the closest thing I can come up might be Ike Leggett.
Okay,
who could put together Neil Potter and Sid Kramer.
He does have a conciliator reputation for those who know local politics here in Montgomery County, so that's an important point. But I think from the standpoint of, we were talking earlier about people's views of politicians, do you think that people are finding that the conciliators are few and far between today, and that's
I think people do find that. I think that a lot of folks would find the more shrill you are, the more money you're going to be able to raise. I think a lot of people do connect politics with, say, Michael Moore against Ann Coulter, and that isn't a good thing. That's some people would think Jefferson and Hamilton were pretty bloody, but I think that takes it to the extreme. Even so, maybe you might call it, somebody called it a few years ago, the crossfireization of America, which isn't necessarily good.
And is that maybe, in a sense, why he's a teeny bit under the radar? Because being a mediator, a harmonizer, a conciliator isn't as flashy as, you know, pounding your fist.
Right. The last job he did was ambassador to Japan, and there were a couple of jobs, a couple of calming effects we had to have with Japan, a couple of incidents, one involving the military and another involving the sub surfacing underneath a Japanese fishing boat, which killed a number of people. That we had to assuage some hurt feelings justifiably amongst the Japanese. You notice now, though, that we don't have any trouble with Japan. A lot of that's with Howard Baker.
Lee, in teaching history at Montgomery College, I mean, this has got to be incredible. Students have a chance to go, rather than pulling out just the textbook, in some cases, you're pulling out the textbooks you created, or at least the living history books on an important politician. How do you bring that kind of experience that you had sitting down with a politician of this ilk and being able to bring that sense of history to the classroom?
I think some of my students know a lot about Tennessee politicians. I did do a book with Senator Bill Frist on Tennessee senators, and Frist's admonitions were to be kind to everyone. Then I called him and said, I found a guy who embezzled some money from his union. He said, tell it like it is. But other than that, he likes Al Gore. But we were nice to Al Gore. But I think they do hear about Senator McKellar, for example. They do hear about Senator Gore, Senator Hall, and Senator Baker a little bit more than perhaps they want. But they do hear a bit of our research, and I try to keep the colorful stories the ones that are talked about rather than the boring ones.
And not just Tennessee, but Howard Baker came from a long family of politicians as well.
Right. The first Baker that I know of was his grandfather, who was the sheriff of Roane County, Tennessee, and then when he got sick, his grandmother took over. Wow. And we heard some colorful stories the other night about her stopping burglaries at the University of Tennessee. And of course, he married Senator Everett Dirksen. He married Senator Everett Dirksen's daughter, and then Governor Alf Landon's daughter, Nancy Cassabell.
And the whole story, if you want the whole story, you got to read the book, Howard Baker, Conciliator in an Age of Crisis, by our own Montgomery College professor, Lee Annis. And thanks so much, Lee, for being on the show. If people want to learn about Dirksen or Fred Thompson or everybody, get the book. And we want to thank you for watching Campus Conversations. I'm Steve Simon.
And I'm Fritzi Bodenheimer. If you have comments about today's show or suggestions for future episodes, send an email to campus.conversations@montgomerycollege.edu. For all of us here at Campus Conversations, thanks for watching.